Deadly Rites by Anthony Darder, Chapter 1. The air in the Argentine farmhouse was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and heavy, humid heat. Wolfgang sat at the head of the table, his face a map of secrets he had kept for 20 years. "I never thought it would be you, Dash," Wolfgang said, his voice raspy. "I trusted you. You broke bread at my table." Dash sat across from him, his movements languid, his suit jacket unbuttoned. He tapped a cigarette against the silver case. "It's the end of the line, Wolf. You are wanted for war crimes. I'm here to see you get your day in court." Wolfgang's eyes narrowed. In a blur of motion that betrayed his age, he produced a pistol from beneath the table. Dash's own Browning high power was in his hand before Wolfgang had even cleared the table's edge. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He had played this scene in a dozen different languages across a dozen different borders. "You must pay for your crimes," Dash said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "My crimes?" Wolfgang sneered, his grip tightening on the pistol. "We were trying to purify the world of scum." He looked at Dash, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "I must decline." With those words, he raised the pistol to his temple and pulled the trigger. The report of the gun was sharp, a violent punctuation mark in the stillness of the Argentine night. Wolfgang slumped forward, his forehead hitting the tablecloth with a soft thud. The smell of cordite drifted across the remains of the meal, mingling with the cheap cologne the old man favored. Dash didn't flinch. He sat for a moment, watching the blood pool around the base of the wineglass, a dark, viscous stain on the lace. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaled a thin plume of blue smoke, and finally rose to his feet. He leaned down and checked the man's pulse, a professional courtesy, before slipping his Browning back into his shoulder holster. He moved to the telephone in the hallway, lifting the heavy Bakelite receiver. "Operator," Dash said, his voice calm. "Get me long distance. Missouri, District 9. He waited, the rhythmic clicking of the rotary dial sounding like a countdown. The line crackled through the Midwest static, eventually clearing into the familiar, gravelly voice of V. "McCall," V said, cutting straight to the point. "Wolfgang is off the board, V," Dash said, staring out the window at the dense, dark tree line of the pampas. "He took the coward's exit. Send the cleanup crew to the estancia. I'm ready to move on." "Good work, Dash," V replied, the line hissing with the vast distance between Argentina and the heart of the Ozarks. "The file for the next assignment will be waiting for you when you land. Get some sleep on the flight back. You're going to need a clear head for the briefing." Dash hung up the phone and stood in the silence of the farmhouse. He looked back at the body one last time. He wasn't thinking about the next mission yet. He was thinking about a drink, the long flight ahead, and the simple, quiet luxury of a night where he didn't have to be anything other than himself. He stepped out into the night, the Argentine air cool against his face. The only thing that mattered was finding a car that would get him to the airfield before dawn. He took Wolfgang's. The flight back to District 9 was relaxing. Well, as relaxing as it could be after watching an SS commander blow his brains all over the roasted lamb. The whiskey that swirled in his glass and the cigarette in his lips helped. When he awoke, he was back at District 9. He was met at the entrance by Gizmo, who had left the lab long enough for a cup of coffee and a sandwich. "It's a shame about that fucking Nazi blowing his brains out. If someone was gonna shoot him, it should have been you," Gizmo said. "Those rounds I packed for you would have done a better job." Dash laughed. "If I had used the rounds you packed for me, I would have missed my flight because I would still be washing crowd off me." Gizmo took a bite of his sandwich, grease spotting his lab coat, and leaned back against the wall. The air in District 9 was cool and heavy with the scent of ozone. He watched Dash, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. "Fair enough," Gizmo muttered, swallowing. "V's been keeping to himself since your call. He's already got the file pulled, sitting on his desk. He's just waiting for you to walk in and confirm what he already knows. Dash didn't move toward the inner command center. He pulled a silver case from his jacket, flicked it open, and lit a cigarette. He inhaled deeply, watching the smoke swirl into the dim, artificial light of the tunnel. He felt the weight of the last 24 hours settling into his shoulders. A dull, persistent ache that vibrated in time with the facility's distant, low-frequency generators. "Let him wait," Dash said, his voice echoing slightly against the wall. He stayed leaning against it, eyes half closed. He wasn't eager to cross into the heart of the office. For now, he was content to just stand there, savoring the silence, grateful that for the moment, he could finally stop looking over his shoulder. Dash crushed his cigarette against the wall and flicked the butt toward the bin, the small ember dying in the cool, dimly lit corridor. He straightened his jacket, pulling his shoulders back to mask the fatigue that still dragged at his frame. "All right," he muttered, his voice barely rising above the low hum of the facility. "Let's get this over with." He stepped toward the heavy door of V's office and pushed it open. The space inside was small, crowded with filing cabinets and a desk that seemed to groan under the weight of decades of classified intelligence. V didn't look up from a report as Dash entered, his silhouette framed by the flickering overhead bulb. Dash walked to the center of the room and stopped. He didn't sit. He just stood there, letting the silence hang for a moment before he started the report. "Months of playing that part," Dash said, his voice clipped and dry. "Learning the rhythm of the farmhouse, the way he looked at the horizon, even the way he liked his coffee. I became the American expat who just wanted a quiet life in the pampas. I earned his trust by showing him the same rot he carried inside himself." He looked at V, who finally stopped reading and rested his hands on the desk. "It was a long game, V," Dash continued, his tone devoid of pride. "I watched him in that house, day after day, waiting for the right moment to close the net. And in the end, it took 5 minutes of conversation at the dinner table to remind him that his past was never going to leave him alone." Dash gestured vaguely toward the door. "He didn't give me the satisfaction of a trial, and he didn't give me the chance to bring him back in chains. He looked at me, he saw the end of the road, and he made sure he was the one who pulled the trigger." He watched V's face, waiting for the reaction, the inevitable critique of a job that had ended in a suicide rather than an extraction. "The job is done. The file can be closed." To his surprise, V was not angry. The mission did not end the way they hoped. "You are learning, Dash. I believe I have finally gotten through to you. You didn't kill him at first sight. You didn't blow the country off the map. You handled yourself as a gentleman. I'm proud of you," V said, "very proud." Dash stood motionless, the air in the room suddenly feeling even thinner. He blinked, certain for a split second that the fatigue of the long flight had finally induced a hallucination. V didn't do proud. V did mission parameters, efficiency reports, and cold, hard calculus. "Gentlemen," Dash echoed, the words sounding foreign in the cramped, windowless office. He let out a short, hollow breath that might have been a laugh if there was any humor left in the day. "I watched a man turn his dinner into a graveyard, V. There's nothing gentlemanly about standing there watching him pull the trigger because he didn't have the stomach to face what we were bringing him back to." V leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. He didn't look like a man who was joking. He looked like a man who had been waiting a long time to see a specific kind of restraint. "You think this is about the outcome," V said, his voice dropping into that familiar, gravelly register that commanded attention. "You think because the target didn't end up in a holding cell, you failed. But that wasn't the goal, was it?" V gestured to the empty chair across from him, though Dash remained standing. "The goal was the slow burn, Dash. The months of patience. The infiltration. You didn't just take him out. You broke his resolve. You became the mirror he couldn't stand to look into anymore. That is a skill, not a blunder." V paused, his eyes narrowing. "Most men would have gotten impatient. They would have gone in loud. You played the role until he did the work for us. That is control. That is what I've been trying to teach you. Dash looked down at his own hands, still steady, despite the tremor of adrenaline that had finally begun to fade. He realized then that V wasn't talking about the assignment at all. He was talking about the evolution of the man standing in front of him. I didn't do it for your pride, V, Dash said, his voice low and steady. I did it because it was the only way to get out of that farmhouse alive. Perhaps, V conceded with a thin, tight-lipped smile. But the result remains the same. You're becoming an asset I can actually trust with the long game. Dash, I'm sending you to Paris, V said. We received word from a contact that a woman that wishes to remain anonymous had just escaped a situation. A group of aristocrats from all over the world gather in Paris to kidnap poor people from the streets and force them to play a series of perverse and deadly games for their own sick pleasures. They bet on them like horses. The mission is to infiltrate this circle and destroy it from within. Dash didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on V, the weight of the last few months in Argentina suddenly feeling like a childhood game compared to what had just been laid out. The low hum of the District 9 generators seemed to grow louder, filling the silence between them. He didn't need to ask for the details of the perverse games. He knew exactly what kind of people they were. The ones who treated life as a theater production where the props bled and the scenery was built from human misery. A circle of aristocrats, Dash said, his voice quiet, cold, and utterly steady. You're talking about a level of entitlement that isn't just dangerous, it's insulated. They don't just kill, they curate. And you want me to walk into their gallery and burn it down? He finally took a step forward, his shadow falling across the edge of the desk. He wasn't thinking about the farmhouse in the Pampas anymore. His mind was already cataloging the architecture of Paris, the social layers of the 16th arrondissement, and the clinical distance required to tear a group like that apart without getting caught in the machinery of their games. This woman, Dash said, looking at the desk where the file was sure to be waiting. Did she give a name, or is she just the first ghost in a gallery that's about to get a lot more crowded? No, she didn't leave a name. She said that if anyone wins the game, they are paid and sworn to secrecy. Anyone that talks dies. V replied. I know you just returned from a mission and had requested a vacation, but you are needed for this, Dash. These sick bastards are playing games widey human lives. You have to blend in. Make them think you are some bored aristocrat looking to spend money on these games. Be careful. These are old money aristocrats. They can smell a new money player. Chapter 2. The descent into Orly Airport was smooth, but for Dash, the silence in the cabin was merely a precursor to the noise he would have to manufacture. By the time he checked into his suite at the Hotel Rites, the transition was complete. The room was an opulent display of gold leaf, heavy velvet, and sweeping views of the Place Vendôme, the kind of environment that shouted old-world legitimacy. It was, as V had insisted, exactly the sort of stage he needed to occupy. He spent the daylight hours navigating the city not as a tourist, but as a predator mapping the social topography of Paris. He moved through the gilded cafes and the exclusive boutiques, observing the way the city's elite moved and who they favored. He needed to find the invisible threads that tethered the powerful to one another. He ended his first night at the Moulin Rouge. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the lingering sweet haze of Turkish tobacco. Dash sat at a corner table, a bottle of chilled vintage champagne sweating in a silver bucket beside him, a tin of beluga caviar resting on the ice. He kept his posture loose, his gaze languid, projecting the aura of a man who had seen everything the world had to offer and found most of it wanting. Then, the seat beside him shifted. A woman in her early 40s slid into the chair, her presence as sharp and deliberate as a stiletto. She was beautiful, with the composure that suggested she didn't just walk into a room, she owned it. Are you enjoying the show? She asked, her voice cutting through the thrum of the music. Dash didn't startle. He turned with the practiced, slow grace of a man who expected nothing and was rarely surprised. "Dancing women in various stages of undress," he replied, his voice dry and devoid of enthusiasm. "What's not to like?" She tilted her head, her eyes assessing him with a clinical intensity that went beyond simple flirtation. "You look bored." "I was hoping the city had something more exciting," Dash admitted, taking a slow sip of his champagne. She offered a thin, enigmatic smile. "I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I am Baroness Ingrid von Kessler." Dash set his glass down, his expression shifting into a mask of polite aristocratic interest. "Von Kessler, a German baroness? Impressive. I am Dashiell von McCall, American." She laughed, a short, brittle sound that seemed to delight in his jab. "What do you do, Mr. McCall?" "I inherited one of the largest oil wells in the state of Oklahoma, Baroness," he said, his tone smooth and unbothered. "The McCall Oil Company is one of the largest in the United States." It was a well-crafted lie. The company was real, and it was gargantuan, just entirely unrelated to his lineage. Ingrid looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding if he were a toy worth keeping. She stood abruptly, the rustle of her dress punctuating the end of the conversation. "Well, I must be going," she said, leaning in just close enough for the scent of her perfume to overwhelm the room. She pressed a heavy, embossed card into his hand. "If you get tired of seeing tits, I meet with some friends every Friday night. I'll show you how we really have fun in Paris." With a final, knowing glance, she turned and vanished into the crowd, leaving Dash alone with a card that felt, in the dim light of the club, like a death warrant. It was only Tuesday, and the city still stretched out before him, vast and indifferent. Dash retreated to his suite, the opulence of the Rites providing a cold, quiet sanctuary. He spent the night in the kind of restless stasis known only to men waiting for a trap to spring. The next morning, he arrived at the address on the Baroness's card. It was a relic of the 19th century, a skeletal, crumbling opera house that looked as if it had been exhaled by the city and then forgotten. There were no playbills pasted to the weathered masonry, no neon lights, and no sign of life. To the passing Parisians, it was merely an architectural corpse, but to Dash, it felt like a hollowed-out skull. He stood before the locked, rusted doors, sensing the weight of something heavy and dark breathing beneath the floorboards. A phantom living beneath the stage, he mused. He didn't force the lock. He didn't need to. He already had his seat at the Baroness's table come Friday. With 3 days to kill, Dash leaned into his persona. He played the part of the aimless, wealthy expat, wandering the city with a feigned detachment that was as rehearsed as a stage play. He found himself standing in the shadow of Notre Dame, the gargoyles staring down with a judgment that felt far more honest than the Baroness's smile. He even found himself indulging in the absurdity of his own role, slipping into a dry, ironic wit that he usually kept buried. When a local cleric scurried past him near the cathedral entrance, Dash caught the man's attention, his expression perfectly composed. "Pardon," Dash said, his voice smooth and vaguely amused. "I'm looking for the local resident. The hunchback? He doesn't seem to be home." The priest blinked, nonplussed and flustered, before hurrying away. Dash watched him go, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. He was deep in the character now, a man with too much money, too much time, and not enough fear, all the better to hide the blade he was sharpening for Friday night. The afternoon light began to slant sharply through the plane trees lining the Champs-Élysées, casting long, fractured shadows across the pavement. Dash remained a fixture of the city's indifference, moving through the crowds with a steady, unhurried pace. He treated the streets not as a destination, but as a backdrop, carefully curating the persona of a man who owned everything he looked at and cared for none of it. He wandered into the Jardin des Tuileries, finding a solitary chair near the fountains. He sat there for the better part of an hour, watching the Parisians and tourists alike. He caught himself observing the geometry of the crowd, the way people grouped together, the way the guards shifted their weight, the subtle cues of body language that betrayed nervousness or intent. He caught himself, consciously loosening his shoulders, allowing his expression to slacken into that vacant, indulgent look of a bored heir who had run out of diversions. His walk back took him through the winding, narrow arteries of the city, where the stone buildings stood close enough to touch, and the air felt thick with history and secrets. He paused in front of an antique bookstore, his reflection caught in the glass. He looked the part of the refined, reckless American, a man whose only worry was his next drink. It was a performance he was becoming increasingly comfortable with, a necessary armor for what lay beneath the city's surface. By the time he reached the Place Vendôme, the sky was a deep velvet blue. The Ritz stood ahead, glowing with an inviting golden warmth that felt almost artificial compared to the gritty reality he was tracking. He walked up the steps, his gait leisurely, matching the tempo of the late afternoon. The lobby was hushed, opulent, and smelled of polished wood and expensive lilies. He didn't check his watch. He didn't need to. He simply moved toward the elevator, the quiet click of his heels on the marble floor the only sound in his world. Once inside the suite, the door clicked shut, sealing him off from the city's noise. He stripped off his coat and tossed it over the back of a velvet armchair. The weight of the day and the anticipation of Friday finally settling into his bones. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid, stood by the window, and watched the Parisian night begin to take hold. He had all the time in the world. Dash crossed the room, the heavy curtains already pulled against the encroaching dark, when a sharp, rhythmic rapping echoed through the suite. It was precise, the kind of knock that expected an answer. He opened the door to find a bellhop standing in the dim hallway, holding a salver with a single crisp envelope. Dash didn't ask questions. He simply pulled a crisp bill from his pocket, pressed it into the man's palm, and took the telegram. The door clicked shut with a solid final sound. He walked back to the center of the room, the paper cool and heavy in his hand. He tore the seal, his movements unhurried, and scanned the short, typewritten message. A faint smile touched his lips. Not the bored, aimless grin he wore for the public, but something sharper. Something that didn't reach his eyes. Dinner, he murmured, the word barely audible in the stillness of the room. Tomorrow night. He tossed the telegram onto the side table, where it sat like a challenge against the polished mahogany. The timeline had shifted. The Baroness wasn't waiting for the Friday night social circuit. She was moving him up the board. "Looks like I have a date with a Baroness," he said to the empty room, his voice flat and steady. He walked over to the sideboard, his reflection in the mirror betraying nothing but a calm, predatory patience. Tomorrow the show would begin. The fact that the Baroness knew what hotel he was staying in told him that she was having him watched. It was to be expected. Women usually become obsessed with him. But after a brief encounter, usually it didn't happen until after the sex. These rich people move fast. Dash let the thought settle as he poured a finger of bourbon, the liquid catching the low light of the room. He didn't need to look at the door to know that there was likely a pair of eyes trained on his window from the street below. It was a standard tactic, the kind of amateur surveillance he'd navigated in a dozen different cities. But the timing of it was what snagged his attention. Usually, the obsession was a slow burn, a dance that unfolded in the bedroom or over a month of expensive dinners. To have them hovering outside his suite after a single brief exchange at the Moulin Rouge suggested that his McCall oil persona was being vetted far more aggressively than he'd anticipated. He took a slow sip, his eyes tracking the movement of a pair of headlights as they swept across the ceiling. These people didn't just want a plaything. They were curators, and they were already appraising the merchandise. "That was fast," he muttered to himself, his voice a low scrape of irony. He leaned against the window frame, his silhouette barely visible from the street. They wanted a show, and they wanted it fast. He would give them exactly what they were looking for. A man with too much money, a lack of restraint, and a hunger that would make him the perfect, unscripted guest. If they wanted to watch, he would make sure they saw exactly what he wanted them to see. Chapter 3. The morning sun filtered through the lobby's tall windows, catching the dust motes dancing over the polished marble. Dash stood at the concierge desk, his attention focused on the silver cigarette case in his hand. He was just snapping a filter to his lips when the heavy glass doors swung open, bringing with them a rush of city air and a voice that was pure, grating Manhattan. Checking in, the penthouse suite. My bags are already in the trunk of the Bentley. Dash paused, the matchbook hovering midair. He turned, leaning casually against the mahogany counter, and took in the man standing at the register. It was Julian Belmont. Even in the lobby of the Rites, he looked like he was suffering through a public indignity, his nose perpetually tilted at an angle that suggested he found the oxygen in the room beneath his station. He was the product of generations of silver-spooned entitlement, a man whose great-grandfather had built an empire on real estate and philanthropy, leaving Julian to spend the inheritance on arrogance. Dash didn't hesitate. He smoothed his jacket, set his features into a mask of eager, wealthy curiosity, and strolled over. Dash McCall. McCall Oil, he said, offering a hand that carried the easy confidence of a man who owned half the state of Oklahoma. I'm in town for a bit of business. What brings you to Paris? Belmont didn't even fully turn his head. He glanced at Dash's hand as if it were a suspicious stain, then looked him up and down with a bored, flicking gaze. I travel here weekly, he said, his voice dripping with dismissive condescension. McCall Oil? How nice. With that, he pivoted on his heel and strode toward the elevators, leaving Dash standing in the wake of his disdain. Dash stayed there for a beat, watching the elevator doors slide shut before he turned back to the concierge, who was witnessing the entire exchange with a strained professional neutrality. What an asshole, Dash remarked, his tone light but cutting. The clerk's expression shifted, the thin veneer of service breaking into something more honest. Very much so, sir. He treats everyone as if they are dog shit on the bottom of his shoe. Dash tilted his head, intrigued. Why do you put up with it? Because he pays well, the clerk said, his eyes glinting with a hidden, spiteful pleasure. Truthfully, sometimes when he orders room service, the chef gives him the special. Dash raised an eyebrow. What exactly is the special? The clerk leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. When Mr. Belmont is being exceptionally rude, the chef ejaculates into his food. A slow, genuine grin spread across Dash's face. Not his fake playboy smirk, but something amused and dangerous. He tucked his lighter away. Remind me, he chuckled, never to upset the cook. The Parisian morning was crisp, the air smelling of roasted beans and damp stone. Dash found a small, sun-drenched cafe on a quiet corner. Pulling out a chair and ordering a black coffee, he sat back, eyes scanning the street. Not with suspicion, but with the lazy, practiced detachment of a tourist who had nowhere to be. He had barely finished his second sip when a shadow fell across his table. A young woman stood there, her clothes frayed and her posture hunched against the morning chill. Her eyes darted toward the street, wary and desperate. Excuse me, sir, she murmured, her voice barely rising above the low hum of the cafe traffic. I hate to bother you, but I am hungry. Could you spare a few francs? Dash set his cup down slowly. He didn't look at her with pity, but with a sharp, calculating interest. He leaned back, his thumbs hooked casually into his waistcoat. I can help you, he said, his voice even. But first, what is your name? She shifted her weight, glancing nervously toward the intersection. Danielle. she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Dash reached into his breast pocket, his movements deliberate. He produced a 20-franc note and held it out. As she reached for it, her fingers brushed his. He saw the genuine, raw shock of relief break across her face, followed by a shimmer of tears in her eyes. "Bless you," she whispered, her voice cracking. The words were barely out of her mouth when a heavy boot thud echoed on the pavement. A police officer, his face set in a mask of grim authority, surged up from the crowd and clamped a hand onto Danielle's arm with enough force to make her cry out. Dash rose, his movements smooth and controlled, his brow furrowed in a display of well-timed indignation. "What is this?" he demanded, stepping into the officer's space. The officer didn't blink. He gave Dash a hard, unimpressed look, his hand drifting toward the truncheon at his belt. "Stay out of this, sir," he snapped. "She is under arrest for vagrancy. I suggest you stay out of it unless you want to go with her." Dash held his ground for a heartbeat, his jaw tight, weighing the risk of intervention against his mission. But the officer's hand was already tightening on his holster, and a second patrolman was moving in from across the street. The net was closing, and the scene here would draw the wrong kind of attention. He exhaled, forcing his features to settle back into the mask of the wealthy, disconnected American. He stepped back, offering a dismissive upward wave of his hand. "My mistake," Dash said, his voice cold. "Carry on." He watched, motionless, as they dragged the crying woman away, her boots scraping against the cobblestones. He stood by his unfinished coffee, the warmth of the morning sun suddenly feeling very thin and very far away. He turned and walked in the opposite direction, his heart rate steady, his mind already calculating what this meant for the city he was currently forced to call home. The arrest of the girl had been a jarring reminder that Paris wasn't just a playground. It was a cage, and the bars were closing in. Dash needed to shed the image of the sympathetic stranger and get back into the role of the arrogant, untouchable heir. He spent the next few hours at a private gentleman's club near the Place de la Concorde. It was the sort of place where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of old money, and where a man like Dash, if he played his cards right, could listen to the vibrations of the city's true power structure. He sat in a leather armchair, a tumbler of whiskey in hand, eavesdropping on a conversation between two men in tailored suits about the rising price of crude and the geopolitical instability in the Middle East. He allowed himself to interject just once, dropping a practiced, cynical comment about the inefficiency of the Oklahoma pipelines in a tone that oozed bored, inherited wealth. The two men didn't question him. Why would they? He looked like them, sounded like them, and drank like them. But as the afternoon wore on, a different kind of anxiety began to gnaw at him. He was performing perfectly, but the Baroness had already made it clear she was watching. Was this club being watched too? Was his McCall oil story going to hold up under a real corporate audit if she decided to dig? Or was he going to have to burn that identity and move on before the check even arrived at dinner? He checked his gold watch, a heavy, ticking weight on his wrist. It was time to head back to the Rites and prepare for the Baroness. The oil baron persona was established, but tonight, the real work began. The walk back to the Rites was a masterclass in controlled composure. Dash moved through the late afternoon crowds with a leisurely, unbothered stride, but his mind was already in the suite, stripping away the layers of his day. He bypassed the lobby, ignoring the concierge's polite nod, and let himself into the sanctuary of his room. The heavy door clicked shut, locking out the city and the scrutiny of the streets. The air in the suite was still, charged with a quiet anticipation. Dash walked straight to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face to wash away the grit of the Parisian streets and the lingering sight of the girl being dragged off by the police. He stood before the mirror for a long moment, watching his own reflection. He adjusted his tie, a perfectly knotted silk tie that screamed pedigree, and straightened his lapels. He moved to the bedroom where he had laid out his attire. He wasn't just dressing for dinner, he was dressing for a confrontation disguised as a romance. He donned a bespoke evening jacket, the material dark and sharp as a shadow. He checked the hidden holster beneath his arm, ensuring the weight of the pistol was balanced and accessible. He wouldn't need it tonight, but the familiar cold pressure against his ribs was the only thing that felt real. He took a moment to inspect his reflection one last time. He looked exactly like the man he claimed to be, the arrogant, untouchable heir to an oil fortune. There was no trace of the operative. He checked his pocket watch. It was time. He picked up his cufflinks, the gold catching the dim light of the suite, and fastened them with steady, practiced fingers. He felt the familiar calm settle over him, the silence before the strike. He didn't just walk out of the room, he exited, ready to be the man the Baroness expected to see, and perfectly prepared to be the one she didn't. The restaurant was a cathedral of excess, all velvet drapes, crystal chandeliers that glittered like frozen tears, and waiters who moved with the silent, predatory grace of panthers. It was the sort of place where people paid for the privilege of being ignored by the powerful. And to Dash, it felt like an airless vault. He entered with a practiced, languid swagger, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the corner table where the Baroness sat. She was a vision of cool, lethal elegance. In the low light, the sharp lines of her face seemed to soften, and she wore a gown that suggested she didn't just understand the value of things. She understood their price. She looked a decade younger than the woman he'd met at the Moulin Rouge, possessing an ease that only came from being born into this gilded cage. Dash slid into the chair opposite her, his movements smooth. As he sat, a flicker of memory surfaced. V, pacing a sterile room, drill sergeant intense. Outside in, Dash. Don't look at the silverware like it's a weapon, it's a tool. Use it, don't brandish it. He tucked his napkin into his lap with a flick of his wrist, keeping his face a portrait of bored confidence. He felt the cold, hard weight of the cutlery arrayed before him. A small army of silver. Outside in. He took a breath, his pulse steady. He wouldn't let the etiquette betray him. "You look radiant, Baroness," Dash said, his voice dropping into that smooth, slightly arrogant register he'd perfected. He didn't wait for her to speak. He signaled the waiter with a subtle lift of his chin, the gesture of a man who had never had to raise his voice to be heard. "I hope you aren't disappointed that I didn't bring the oil rigs along for dinner." Ingrid watched him, her eyes tracing his movements with that same clinical intensity from the night before. She wasn't just looking at him, she was dissecting his performance. "Mr. McCall," she replied, her voice a low, melodic purr. "I assure you, a man like yourself is far more interesting than an oil well. Tell me, do you always navigate the world with such practiced indifference? Or is that a costume you keep in your luggage?" Dash allowed a slow, knowing smile to pull at the corner of his mouth. He picked up his water glass, the crystal cool against his skin. "In my experience, Baroness, the truth is rarely as interesting as the costume. But perhaps that's just the American in me." He kept his posture relaxed, even as he mentally mapped the exits and the proximity of the waiters. The stage was set, and the first act had begun. Chapter 4. The dinner was a back and forth between Dash and the Baroness, both trying to size the other up. This is when the gentleman training was really going to have to work. Dash, trying his best to play the arrogant American oil baron, said, "These snails and fish eggs are good, but you should come to the States and try an elk steak. It's marvelous." The Baroness looked at him in amusement. She could tell he wasn't from the old money set, at least not from a family that has had wealth for generations. "Tell me, Mr. McCall, what is it that your company does?" she asks. "We pump the crude from the ground. Then it is transported to our refineries, where the crude oil is heated, separated into its various forms. Some becomes gasoline or petro, as it might be called here, to be used by the customers of our vast network of filling stations. Some become lubricants for various machines. Some get shipped elsewhere to become plastics. There are many different ways that oil is used in our everyday lives, often without us knowing. The world runs on oil, he says. But enough about me. I'm sure your story is even more fascinating. The Baroness listened to his explanation of the oil business, her chin resting on her interlaced fingers. There was a faint, lingering smile on her lips, the look of a cat watching a mouse perform a trick that it clearly learned from a manual rather than from life. Your knowledge of the refinery process is functional, she said, her voice smooth as velvet, though it carried a sharpened edge. And yet, you speak of oil with the affection of a man who has read about it in a textbook, rather than one who has felt the grease under his fingernails as a child. It is very charming, Dash. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving his. As for my story, it is far less industrious than yours. My family survived the wars by being the people who were not there when the bombs fell, and by being the people who were there when the dust settled to buy the land for pennies. We are not creators, Mr. McCall. We are simply persistent. Dash felt the weight of her gaze. She was testing the perimeter of his lie, seeing if the McCall name was just a hollow vessel. He didn't flinch. He leaned back, mimicking the posture of a man who had heard such stories 1,000 times from 1,000 different desperate aristocrats. Persistence, Dash repeated, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. That sounds like a polite word for opportunism. In Oklahoma, we call that being a vulture, but I suppose in Paris, it's called heritage. He risked a smile, keeping it wide and unbothered, hoping to mask the tightening in his chest. He was playing the American brute to a T, blunt, occasionally offensive, and just ignorant enough to be dismissed. You know, Baroness, he added, gesturing vaguely with his fork, the problem with people who buy land after the dust settles is that they forget the dust is usually someone else's home. You talk about being there when the dust settles, but I'm interested in what you were doing. While it was still flying, were you holding the map, or were you the one drawing the lines? The table went quiet. The ambient chatter of the restaurant seemed to dim, pulled into the gravity of their exchange. The Baroness lowered her glass, her eyes narrowing, the amusement finally fading into something much more focused and much more dangerous. You have a very sharp tongue for an oil man, she remarked. Tell me, Dash, is that a natural trait, or did you learn that in the same place you learned how to navigate a formal dinner? I'm an American. We don't have time to learn the bullshit rules of knives and forks, Dash said with a smirk. As far as my knowledge of the oil business, you are correct. My family built the business. They are the ones with the dirt under their nails. They did the dirty work, so eventually we could employ thousands to get dirt under their nails. I was taught how to run the business side, the side that has made McCall oil second only to Standard Oil in the United States. The money was earned through blood, sweat, and perseverance. It is a dangerous business. The Baroness held his gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the only sound at the table was the distant clinking of silverware against fine china, a stark contrast to the weight of the words hanging between them. She wasn't just evaluating his credentials. She was gauging his capacity for violence. Blood and sweat, she murmured, repeating the words as if tasting them. She leaned forward, the candlelight catching the sharp, predatory gleam in her eyes. It is rare to meet an American who admits that money has a cost. Usually, you are all so busy painting your history in bright, optimistic colors that you forget the shade of the foundation. She reached out, her gloved finger tracing the rim of her wine glass. You speak of the danger of the oil business, Mr. McCall, but surely that is merely a matter of balance sheets and safety regulations. You are not suggesting that the board of directors resorts to field adjustments? Dash met her look with a relaxed, almost lazy arrogance, though his hand remained perfectly still beneath the table. He was leaning into the role of the dangerous, slightly reckless heir, the kind of man who would order a hit as easily as he ordered a second bottle of wine. Regulation is for people who can't afford to pay the fine, Baroness. he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that carried a subtle threat. And field adjustments? Let's just say that in Oklahoma, if someone tries to stop you from pumping what's yours, you don't call a lawyer. You make sure they never have the opportunity to stand in your way again. He smirked, picking up his glass and holding it toward her in a mock toast. But I'm sure your circles here in Paris are much more civilized. Everything done with a nod, a whisper, and a signed document. It must be terribly dull compared to the way we do things back home. Ingrid watched him for a long, piercing heartbeat, the silence stretching until it was almost uncomfortable. Then she let out a low, musical laugh, not of amusement, but of recognition. Dull? She whispered, her eyes dark and intense. Oh, Dash, you have no idea how much I've been waiting for someone to stop pretending that this city is made of lace and perfume. She signaled the waiter, her demeanor shifting instantly into something softer, yet no less calculated. Since you have such an appreciation for the dangerous side of business, perhaps you would like to see how we handle field adjustments here in France. My friends are meeting later, and I think they might find your philosophy on American business quite refreshing. She looked at him, her intent clear. The test was over, and he had passed the first gate. Tell me, she said, leaning back, how do you feel about high-stakes games where the currency isn't just money? Was that what the card was about, Friday night? Dash asked. Precisely, she hissed. On Friday nights, we do some gambling. But at a casino. The address on that card is my invitation to a seat at the table. Once you are there, it will all make sense, unless you are afraid to lose some of your American money. Is that why Julian Belmont is here? Dash asked. Oh, do you know Julian? Yes, he is part of our group, Ingrid said. I met him briefly this morning as he was checking into the hotel I'm staying in. Of course, you know that. That is how I got the invitation for this dinner. Dash responded. I had to know more about you. You intrigue me, Mr. McCall, Ingrid said. Has dinner changed your intrigue? Dash asked. Well, let's have dessert at my place and I will be able to answer that question, Ingrid said with a flirtatious grin. Dash could see where this was headed. He knew what she wanted. He would have to do a different kind of performing. But this was an act that Dash knew very well. She reached under the table and brushed against his crotch. Got her, he thought to himself. The hook was set. The air between them seemed to vibrate with the sudden, sharp shift in the evening's temperature. Dash didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He maintained that languid, slightly arrogant posture, the mask of the wealthy American playboy firmly in place, but beneath the table, his muscles were coiled, ready for the next move in this dangerous game of cat and mouse. The Baroness's touch was deliberate, a slow, pressuring glide that was meant to be both a challenge and a surrender. It was the ultimate test of his character, a way to see if he was as hungry, as reckless, and as uninhibited as he claimed to be. Dash let his smirk widen, letting the arrogance slide into something darker, something more predatory. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until he could smell the faint, expensive scent of her perfume, a mix of lilies and something colder, like metallic dust. Dessert, Dash repeated, his voice dropping into a low, husky register that sounded like a promise. I've always had a weakness for things that are a bit dangerous to consume. You've piqued my curiosity, Baroness, and I'm not a man who leaves things unfinished. He signaled for the bill with a snap of his fingers, his movements sharp and precise. He didn't care about the cost. He didn't care about the etiquette anymore. The facade was doing its work, and he was firmly in the driver's seat of the performance. As they stood to leave, Ingrid didn't let go of his arm. Her grip was strong, possessive, as if she were marking her territory before they even left the restaurant. My car's waiting outside, she murmured, her eyes searching his face as if looking for the crack in the armor that would reveal the spy beneath the oil man. Are you prepared for what comes next, Mr. McCall? Because once we leave this room, there is no going back to the simple business of pumping oil. Dash felt the phantom weight of the pistol under his arm, a secret iron pulse against his ribcage. He looked down at her, his expression a perfect, hollow reflection of the man she thought he was. "Baroness," he said, offering his arm to escort her out. "I've been waiting for the real game to start since I landed in Paris. Lead the way." They moved through the restaurant like a current, heads turning to watch the mysterious American oil tycoon and the elegant, untouchable woman who had suddenly decided to claim him. Her palace was impressive. Not that Dash had time to take it all in. Ingrid rushed him through the house to her bedroom. As he looked at the lace and silk that adorned the room, he heard the door lock behind him. When he turned to look at her, she was already naked. Her breasts round and firm, her bush the color of gold. This was a woman that knew what she wanted. Before Dash could speak, he was undressed, and she had him on the bed. When she took him into her mouth, he found that not only did she know what she wanted, she also knew what she was doing. When she had finished that job to completion, with the skill that only the world's best prostitutes knew, Dash knew he had to be on his game and return the favor. Return the favor he did. He lost count of how many orgasms she had, to the point she was begging him to stop. Dash was impressed. The Baroness was speechless. After a rest, they were ready for another round. By the time they were done, the sun was peeking through the curtains, and Dash left to get some rest. The games begin tonight. The morning air was cool, a sharp contrast to the humid, lingering heat of the Baroness's bedroom. Dash stepped out of the heavy iron gates of her estate, his movements fluid and unhurried, though his mind was already sharpening into a razor's edge. He adjusted his jacket, the weight of the pistol against his ribs a grounding, familiar comfort. The night had been a success, but not in the way she likely intended. She had sought to use him, to satisfy a curiosity, and perhaps to mark him as her own. But in the heat of the encounter, the balance of power had shifted. She was a woman who lived by dominating others. But in the exhaustion that had finally stilled her, he had seen the one thing she couldn't hide. An unexpected, raw vulnerability. He had pushed her to her limit, and in that vulnerability, he had seen the cracks. He walked toward the hotel, the city beginning to wake around him. The streets were quiet, the early light turning the stone of the buildings into shades of soft, bruised gold. He wasn't just tired, he was focused. The Baroness was a key, but the true objective remained the game on Friday night. Tonight, the pressure would be different. He had been invited to the table, not as a playboy, but as a player. And that meant he needed to be smarter than everyone else in the room. He reached the Rites, slipped past the morning staff, and let himself into his suite. The room was cold, empty, and silent. He poured a glass of water, drinking it down in one go, and stripped off his clothes, tossing them aside. He didn't sleep immediately. He sat in the dark for a long time, staring out at the city as it began its day. He had the Baroness's trust, or at least her obsession. He had the invitation. He had the persona. He lay back on the bed, closing his eyes, his breathing slowing until it was perfectly, rhythmically steady. He would sleep for 3 hours, not a minute more, not a minute less. When he woke, he would start the final preparations for the night ahead. The mask was secure, the blade was sharpened, and the game was about to change forever. Chapter 5. The heavy iron gates of the old opera house stood wide open, framing a scene that felt entirely out of place against the decaying architecture. The skeletal, crumbling masonry, which had felt like a tomb just days before, was now alive with the chaotic, electric energy of a high-fashion shoot. Cables snaked across the cracked pavement like black vines. Heavy tungsten lights flared, casting stark, dramatic shadows against the weathered stone, and a crew of assistants scrambled back and forth in a flurry of French commands and rattling equipment. Outside, a photographer was actively directing a pair of models draped in avant-garde autumn wools, the rapid-fire click of the camera shutter cutting sharply through the night air. Dash paused at the edge of the perimeter, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his impeccably tailored evening coat. He wore his posture like armor, relaxed, confident, yet entirely aware of every exit and angle. Standing behind a tripod just a few feet away, a striking young woman with dark, sharp eyes and a battered leather camera bag slung over her shoulder caught sight of him. She didn't look at him like the locals did, with indifference or fear. She looked at him with the clinical, appraising gaze of someone who studied human geometry for a living. She took in the cut of his suit, the expensive fabric, and the absolute stillness in his stance amid the organized chaos. She lowered her camera, letting it hang by its strap against her chest, and walked right up to him. "Hey," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the set. "Would you like to be in the next shot?" Dash offered a slow, easy smile, keeping his expression light and the playboy facade firmly in place. "I'm not what you would call the model type. What are you doing here? This place does not look like a good backdrop for fashion." She tilted her head, a confident, slightly challenging grin playing at the corners of her mouth. "That is where you're wrong, Mr. McCall, Dash McCall. Mr. McCall," she said, her eyes glinting with amusement as she extended a hand. "You need to see the beauty in the ruin. This is a perfect place for fashion photography. Yvette Moretti, Elle Magazine." Dash took her hand, feeling the slight calluses on her fingers, the mark of someone who actually worked her craft rather than just holding a device. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Moretti." The crew swarmed through the heavy oak doors, hauling heavy wooden crates, brass lampstands, and massive electronic flash packs into the cavernous interior. Dash stepped across the threshold, and the chaotic noise of the street instantly vanished, swallowed by the immense hollow volume of the hall. Where the exterior spoke of neglect, the inside whispered of forgotten royalty. Towering marble pillars stretched upward to a vaulted ceiling crusted with gold leaf and peeling frescoes. Gilded balconies curved along the perimeter like the ribs of a giant sleeping beast, and chandeliers, though unlit, hung like frozen waterfalls of crystal dust. While the crew shouted across the expanse and hauled stands into position, Dash's eyes were already working. He didn't look like a tourist admiring the architecture. His gaze flicked upward to the catwalks, traced the thick shadows beneath the grand staircase, and mentally cataloged the heavy side exits and the main doors. 2 primary routes in, 3 out, and enough blind spots in the masonry to hide a platoon. "This way, Mr. McCall," Yvette's voice cut through his tactical calculations. She stood behind a heavy professional medium-format camera mounted on a sturdy studio tripod, squinting through the waist-level viewfinder as she made a fine adjustment to the focus knob. "Stand right here. The model will look lovingly at you while you look away. I'm going to call this the ruin of passion." Dash masked his momentary hesitation with a smooth, self-deprecating chuckle. "Never thought I'd be immortalized in a ruin, Miss Moretti, but who am I to argue with art?" He stepped into position, turning his profile to the camera just as a tall model draped in sweeping black silk stepped close, pressing her cheek near his shoulder with a practiced, smoldering gaze. Dash stared off into the middle distance, his expression deadpan and aloof. Chimwur. The studio strobe flashed blindingly white against the gloom, the heavy capacitor pack humming as it recycled power for the next frame. Yvette advanced the roll film back with a crisp, mechanical click, her eyes scanning the scene through the ground glass. "Not bad, McCall. You wear boredom like a second skin." "It's a natural gift," Dash replied, stepping out of the frame and checking his gold pocket watch. There was still time before the underground games were set to begin at 7. He hung back near a crumbling pillar, letting the commotion of angles and exposures wash over him while he watched the crew work. The flashes popped in rapid succession, casting long, erratic shadows across the gilded walls. Suddenly, a gloved hand lightly grazed his forearm, cool, familiar, and deliberate. "This way, Dash." A low melodic voice murmured right beside his ear. He turned his head. The Baroness stood there, impeccably dressed, in a dark velvet coat that seemed to absorb the light, her lips parted in a sharp, knowing smile. She didn't look like a woman waiting in the shadows. She looked like the one who owned them. The Baroness held his arm, not with the gentle touch of a companion, but with the proprietary grip of a collector claiming a rare acquisition. She guided him away from the commotion of the photo shoot, slipping through a discreet, unmarked side door tucked into the shadows of a marble archway. The warmth and noise of the crew vanished instantly, placed by a damp, subterranean chill. They descended a long, narrow hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and unlit brass sconces until they reached a heavy, iron-reinforced door. Inside was an opera box, but it bore no resemblance to the sweeping, open-air balconies of the main auditorium. It was solitary, deeply recessed, and heavily draped in thick, light-absorbing velvet that muffled the outside world entirely. From their elevated vantage point, they looked down not onto rows of dusty velvet seats, but onto a hollowed-out subterranean stage. The stage itself was surreal, fitted with meticulously crafted, hyper-realistic set pieces that looked entirely out of place in the decaying shell of the opera house. It was a staged arena, pristine and theatrical, waiting for actors who played for higher stakes than applause. Moments later, the heavy door clicked open again as the rest of the invited circle trickled into the box, bringing the scent of expensive tobacco, cold night air, and old perfume with them. There was Kenjiro Sato, impeccably tailored, his expression a mask of polite, inscrutable calculation that gave away nothing of his thoughts. Beside him stood Madame Zoya Petrovna, draped in heavy furs despite the indoor chill, her sharp eyes assessing Dash with the cold, calculating weight of a czarist survivor. And finally, Julian Belmont stepped into the box. He sneered the moment he saw Dash, his nose lifting into the air as if he had just stepped in something unpleasant. "Oil, was it?" Belmont asked, his voice dripping with condescension as he adjusted his cuffs. "We'll see how your crude money holds out in a real game." Before Dash could fire back, the Baroness turned, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, warning glint. "Hush, Julian," she hissed, her tone slicing through the air like a razor. "He is with me tonight." Belmont scowled, pulling back with a muttered curse, but Dash didn't blink. He met the American's venomous gaze head-on, flashing a slow, deliberate grin that screamed, "Fuck you." The house lights dimmed, and the first contestant was led to the stage. She was familiar. It was the girl that was asking for money the day before, that the police dragged away crying, Michelle. The attendees clapped. Just then, a voice came over the speaker. "Meet a little beggar, plucked off the street asking for money from a tourist, the kind of trash we do not need on the streets of our beloved Paris." Michelle looked down in shame. The fear in her eyes was noticeable to them all, which made all but Dash happy. Dash was enraged, but had to maintain his persona, to not blow the mission. The voice came back. "You will be given a choice. Behind you are 3 doors. Behind one is 20,000 francs. Behind one is another game. Behind one is a shotgun rigged to fire as the door opens. The choice is yours, but you must choose wisely." Michelle started sobbing. The Russian spoke first. 20 says she picks door 2. Julian was next. 25 on door number 1. The Japanese man didn't bet. He watched in anticipation. "Are you going to bet, oil man?" Belmont asked. "No, I want to watch to see how the game is played first," Dash replied. The Baroness put 20 on door 2. Dash leaned to her. "Why are the bets so low? I figured thousands would be thrown out." "Because like these people, money is worthless. It's about the thrill," the Baroness replied. "Let the game begin." The voice echoed. "What if I refuse to play?" Michelle asked. "Then you die where you stand. Pick a door," the voice said. As Michelle looked at the doors, the bets were raised, $1 at a time. Michelle approached the first door. As she opened it, the report of a shotgun rang out, and she fell to the floor, her face blown away. "Looks like I won," Julian said with a sick smile. Dash's blood was boiling. He could kill them all right here and be on the next flight home. But more would replace them. He had to play it smart and dismantle it thoroughly. The echo of the blast hung in the enclosed vault of the opera box, the smell of cordite and fresh blood drifting up from the stage below. Michelle's lifeless form lay crumpled against the wood, a stark, violent intrusion on the pristine set pieces. Julian Belmont casually reached across the velvet-draped railing, scooping up the crumpled franc notes his companions tossed onto the ledge. His smirk was sickeningly pleased. The casual collection of blood money fitting a man who viewed human life as little more than a disposable currency. Dash stood frozen, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. Every instinct honed by years of operational training screamed at him to draw the pistol tucked beneath his arm and put a bullet through Belmont's skull, followed quickly by the rest of the degenerate spectators. But discipline, cold, ironclad discipline, kept his hand away from his holster. A massacre here would only make him a hunted fugitive, leaving the global syndicate intact and shifting into the shadows. He had to bide his time. Beside him, the Baroness exhaled a soft, amused sigh, leaning her shoulder casually against his. "A messy start," she murmured, her voice entirely devoid of pity. She glanced sidelong at Dash, her eyes dark and probing. "You look tense, Mr. McCall. Did the noise frighten you, or are you simply regretting that you didn't place a wager on the poor girl?" Dash forced his facial muscles to relax, slowly unclenching his fists as he channeled the arrogant, cynical playboy once more. He looked down at the stage, his expression flattening into a mask of bored indifference. "Frightened? Hardly, Baroness," Dash replied, his voice steady and cold. "I just prefer my investments to have a better return than a coin toss. If I wanted to watch someone throw their life away, I'd have stayed in Oklahoma." Kenjiro Sato finally spoke, his voice a low, smooth baritone, as he watched the stage hands dragging the body away into the wings. "The American has a point. Crude wages are for amateurs. The real game requires a pattern." "Indeed," Zoya Petrovna added, leaning forward, her lips curling into a sharp smile as the voice over the loudspeaker crackled to life once more, announcing the arrival of the next contestant for round 2. Dash kept his eyes fixed on the stage, the fury inside him hardening into a razor-sharp focus. They thought this was a game. By the end of the night, he intended to change the rules. Chapter 6. The harsh glare of the spotlights carved 2 pools of stark white light out of the subterranean gloom, illuminating a long, polished mahogany table laden with an extravagant feast. Roasted pheasant, gleaming silver bowls of fruit, delicate pastries, and crystal carafes of wine sat arranged in meticulous alignment. To anyone else, it would look like a banquet for kings. To the 2 trembling young men shoved into the arena, it was a gauntlet of agonizing choices. The voice crackled over the intercom once more, smooth and devoid of any human empathy. "Our next game of the night is the Gourmet Paradox. 2 players sit at the table filled with various foods. Some are perfectly fine, while others are poisoned. One plate, should they be unfortunate enough to take from it, is on a pressure plate. If the pressure fluctuates, it triggers a small bomb. Each player has to take a bite, or they both die. Once the first bite is eaten, another option is provided. A gun will be given to a player, and if they kill their opponent, they leave with their life and 10,000 francs. Down below, the 2 contestants stared at the spread, paralyzed by terror. One of them, a gaunt young man with hollow eyes, swallowed hard and reached out with a shaking hand toward a silver platter. his fingers hovering over a piece of fruit. Beside Dash in the private box, a soft, breathless sigh broke the heavy silence. "Oh, Dash, this one is my favorite," the Baroness murmured. Dash glanced sideways at her. The clinical cruelty of the game hadn't repulsed her. Instead, it had flushed her skin and dilated her pupils. The anticipation of watching human lives unravel under the pressure of poison, explosives, and murder acted on her like an intoxicant, a perverse visceral thrill that sent a cold shudder down Dash's spine. Before he could pull his attention back to the stage, she shifted closer, her body heat pressing against him. She grabbed his hand, guiding it down from the armrest and sliding it beneath the heavy fabric of her skirt, pressing his palm firmly against her wet, awaiting parts. "Play with me while we watch," she whispered, her voice a low, rasped command laced with raw arousal. The juxtaposition of the cold-blooded slaughter unfolding on the stage below and the warm, demanding touch of the woman beside him was grotesque. Every fiber of Dash's being tightened in revulsion. The sheer depravity of the scene threatened to break his carefully constructed composure. But he knew the cost of hesitation, masking his disgust behind the smooth, unreadable smirk of the arrogant oil heir. He forced his fingers to move, playing along with her twisted game while his eyes remained locked on the horrors playing out below. Down on the stage, the tension snapped as both men hastily swallowed their bites. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The food was fine. In fact, judging by the brief look of bewildered relief on their faces, it was exquisitely prepared. They had beaten the first cruel hurdle. In accordance with the rules, a heavy steel-gray pistol was slid across the polished mahogany table toward the younger of the two contestants. The man stared at the weapon, his chest heaving. But instead of picking it up to aim at the trembling companion sitting across from him, a surge of raw defiance overtook his fear. He snatched the gun up, spun on his heel, and raised the barrel straight toward the shadowed privacy of their elevated box. "I'll kill you all, you sick bastards!" he screamed, his voice cracking with righteous fury. The threat barely cleared the edge of the stage. Before Dash could even blink, a silenced crack echoed from the flies above. A high-caliber round tore through the contestant's chest, throwing him violently backward onto the floor. Blood pooled rapidly across the pristine set pieces as his lifeless fingers dropped the weapon. Two masked guards immediately materialized from the wings, grabbing the dead man by his arms and dragging his corpse away, leaving a dark, jagged smear across the wood. The second, surviving contestant stood paralyzed, staring in horror at the spot where his partner had just died. The disembodied voice echoed smoothly over the loudspeaker. "The game restarts." Beside Dash, the Baroness let out a long, shuddering breath, her fingers clutching his forearm with a bruising intensity. The sudden violence, the smell of cordite drifting up from the stage, and the absolute disposability of human life had pushed her right to the edge. Her breath came in hot, shallow gasps, her body trembling with a dark, euphoric arousal that threatened to bring her to a climax right there in the velvet-draped dark. The loudspeaker clicked on, the automated coldness of the voice explaining the parameters of the game once more to the terrified new arrival. Down on the stage, the two men cautiously reached for their plates, each taking a measured bite. This time, the survivor from the previous round wasn't so fortunate. Almost instantly, his eyes bulged. He dropped his fork, clawing desperately at his throat as a dark, violent froth of blood spilled past his lips. He choked and convulsed, the agonizing descent dragging out in cruel, slow motion, until he finally collapsed face down onto the polished wood. Beside Dash, the Baroness let out a sharp, unrestrained squeal of pure, visceral pleasure, her body shuddering against his as the man drew his final breath. "Does this mean I won?" The sole remaining contestant cried out into the empty air, his voice cracking with desperate hope. Double or nothing! Julian Belmont yelled down from the box, leaning over the velvet railing with a predatory grin. Eat another item, and you get 20,000 francs. Instantly, the private box erupted into a flurry of motion. The betting started small, but quickly escalated. 5,000, 10, 15. Dash didn't join the shouting match immediately. While the others watched the frantic, sweating contestants scan the remaining spread, Dash's tactical training kicked in. His eyes tracked past the food, looking at the physics of the setup below. Through a subtle gap in the staging, and the way the heavy tablecloth draped over the edge, Dash caught the faint, undeniable outline of a pressure plate wired directly beneath the silver platter holding a perfectly cooked game bird. A grim certainty settled in his stomach. 100,000 says he picks the bomb, Dash said, his voice flat, confident, and dripping with arrogant certainty. Julian Belmont sneered, turning his head sharply. That's a rich bet, oil man. But I'll see your bet. It's a stupid bet. There's only one pressure plate on a table full of food, and the odds are against you. But I'll see it. Around them, Sato and Zoya Petrovna quickly matched the stakes, seeing the American playboy's sudden, reckless gamble as a fool's errand. As much as Dash hated the thought of weaponizing human misery for his own ends, playing the game and winning was the only way to solidify his cover, earn their respect, and secure an invitation back to next week's inner circle where he could dismantle the operation at its root. Down on the stage, the contestant's hand drifted away from the pastries and gravitated straight toward the game bird. He lifted the platter, the subtle shift in weight going completely unnoticed by the desperate man. Before he could even bring a morsel to his mouth, the floor vanished in a concussive roar. The bomb tore through the center of the mahogany table, sending splinters, crystal shards, and the blinding wall of fire upward. The shockwave rattled the glass in the opera box, and when the smoke cleared, the table and the man were nothing more than scattered, smoking debris. Silence hung in the box for a beat, quickly broken by the rustle of currency changing hands. They all paid up, tossing thick wads of cash and promissory markers across the ledge to Dash. He scooped them up with an indifferent smirk, playing the part of the lucky, blood-soaked high roller to perfection. Baroness, make sure he comes back next week, Julian Belmont said, his jaw tight as he handed over his losses, his pride clearly stung. I want to get my money back. I'll make sure of it, the Baroness purred, sliding her hand possessively into the crook of Dash's arm as the rest of the elite circle stood up, murmuring amongst themselves and preparing to leave. The car ride back to the Ritz was spent in heavy, suffocating silence. The moment Dash unlocked the door to his suite, the mask finally cracked. He stripped off his clothes in the dark, marching straight into the bathroom and turning the shower handle all the way to scalding. He stood under the jets for a long time, scrubbing his skin raw, desperate to wash away the phantom filth of the underground slaughterhouse and the lingering, metallic scent of the Baroness from his fingers. The hot water had barely begun to wash away the chill of the underground opera house, when a sharp, distinct snap echoed from the hallway outside. Dash stepped out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, his senses instantly dialed to a razor edge. He opened the suite door just an inch and looked down. A heavy cardstock envelope sat neatly on the carpet. He picked it up, flipped it over, and slid out a small slip of paper written in sharp, expensive ink. Join me for a drink. J.B. Dash stared at the initials. Julian Belmont. The timing was entirely too deliberate, but walking away from a direct confrontation would look like cowardice, a fatal flaw for the arrogant playboy persona he had carefully built. 10 minutes later, fully dressed in a fresh dark shirt and trousers with his holster securely fastened beneath his arm, Dash walked down the silent, carpeted corridor of the luxury hotel. He stopped at the door at the far end of the hall and gave a firm, double knock. The door swung open instantly. Belmont stood there, dressed in a silk smoking jacket, looking entirely too relaxed for a man who had just spent the evening watching people get blown to pieces. "Come in, Mr. McCall. Join me on the balcony," Belmont said, turning his back without waiting for an answer. Dash stepped inside the suite, his eyes sweeping the room for secondary exits, traps, or concealed threats before following Belmont out onto the wrought iron balcony. The cool night air of Paris washed over them, carrying the distant hum of late-night traffic. Belmont picked up a crystal decanter, poured a generous measure of amber scotch into a heavy glass, and slid it across the small outdoor table toward Dash. He didn't offer a toast. He simply leaned against the stone railing, his eyes narrowing as he stared out into the city lights. "I'm gonna cut through the shit, McCall," Belmont said, his voice dropping the theatrical, condescending sneer he wore in front of the others, replacing it with something far more dangerous and cold. "I do not know where you get your money from, but I know it's not McCall oil." Dash kept his expression completely neutral, lifting his glass lazily, as if the accusation were nothing more than a mild annoyance. "Is that so? What makes you so sure?" Belmont turned his head, a thin, triumphant smile playing across his lips. "I know the heir to McCall Oil. We went to the same college." The words hit Dash like a stone dropping straight through his chest. For a split second, his pulse spiked, every muscle in his body tightening as he calculated the distance between them, the angle of a strike, the logistics of a quiet disposal. His cover had a leak, and it was standing right in front of him. Belmont seemed to savor the micro-reaction, reading the slight stillness in Dash's posture as a victory. "Do you want to know why I didn't say anything to the Baroness?" Belmont asked, stepping closer. "Why?" Dash asked, his voice steady, refusing to betray the sudden storm beneath his skin. "Because she sees you as her plaything," Belmont chuckled softly, a venomous, self-satisfied sound. "Just another stupid playboy to fucking discard. She will break you, McCall. And honestly, I want to see her break you. Don't think I break so easily, Julian. I'm going to be honest, you are absolutely right. But if you knew who I really am, you would be shitting your Ivy League trousers. Anybody that gets this close, especially in a threatening manner, usually ends up dead," Dash said, his voice dropping into a low, dead-eyed register accompanied by a cool, terrifying smile. Julian's smug expression wavered for a fraction of a second before hardening into arrogance. "I could buy you, McCall. I have enough to buy the world. I'm not for sale," Dash said softly. "Then I'll kill you," Julian replied, his hand flashing toward his pocket as he whipped out a compact pistol. Before Julian could level the barrel, Dash exploded into motion. He lunged forward, his hand snapping out to clamp around Julian's wrist with a crushing grip, forcing the gun upward. A violent scuffle erupted on the narrow balcony, the two men tangling in a frantic struggle for leverage. Julian swung wildly, but Dash's tactical training took over. With a sharp, decisive pivot, Dash leveraged Julian's own momentum against him. Julian lost his footing on the slick stone edge, his balance deserting him as he tipped backward. For a horrifying heartbeat, Julian clawed at empty air. Then he tumbles over the railing, plummeting straight down into the Parisian night. A sickening heavy thud echoed from the courtyard below. Dash leaned over the edge, his eyes scanning the dark pavement. Julian lay motionless at an unnatural angle, his skull split wide open upon the concrete. Dash didn't hesitate. He stepped back into the suite, his mind calculating every angle of containment. Moving swiftly, he snatched up the crystal glasses they had used and hurled them against the interior wall, shattering them into 1,000 glittering shards to simulate a violent domestic struggle inside the room, rather than an altercation on the balcony. It would muddy the physical evidence of his presence. He checked the hallway. Empty. Dash hurried back to his own suite, slipping through the door just as his heart began to slow. He snatched Julian's invitation card off the desk, tore it into microscopic pieces, and flushed them down the toilet. Striding over to the telephone, he lifted the receiver and dialed the front desk, pitching his voice with just the right amount of startled urgency. "Hello, this is room 412, Dash said, breathing heavily. "I heard shouting and a loud argument next door, followed by glass shattering against the wall. It sounded like someone just jumped off the balcony." Chapter 7. The morning air of Paris was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh pastries and damp cobblestones. But it did little to clear the lingering weight of the previous night from Dash's mind. He walked aimlessly through the bustling streets, trying to shake the phantom echoes of the opera house and the abrupt, violent end he had delivered to Julian Belmont. Before he fully realized where his feet had taken him, he found himself standing on a sidewalk in front of the sleek, modern glass and stone offices of Elle Magazine. As he paused by the entrance, a young staffer rushing out the heavy glass doors stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes locking onto him. A breathless gasp escaped her lips, and she whirled around, shouting back into the lobby. "It's him! Find Yvette!" Confused, Dash blinked and looked around, his instincts instinctively tensing for a trap before he forced his posture to relax into easy curiosity. Within seconds, the door swung open again, and Yvette Moretti stepped out, her battered leather bag slung over her shoulder, and a bright, triumphant grin lighting up her face. "Mr. McCall, I was wondering if I would see you again," Yvette said, stepping right up to him. "My editor saw the contact sheets from yesterday, and she loves your shots. We want to run one in the upcoming issue. Would you mind coming inside to sign a standard release?" "I suppose," Dash said, playing the part of the mildly amused, unsuspecting bystander. They walked past the bustling reception desk and into the inner sanctum of the magazine's creative floor, making their way to Yvette's private office. Across her large wooden desk, several striking black and white prints from the previous night's shoot were laid out in a neat grid. The camera had captured his sharp profile, the heavy shadows of the hall, and that unmistakable, aloof edge in his eyes. Yvette picked up a fountain pen and slid a document across the desk toward him. "You are quite popular around the office?" Dash raised an eyebrow, leaning against the edge of the desk. "What are you talking about?" "The girls who have seen your test shots have been asking all morning who you are," Yvette said with a low chuckle, crossing her arms. "You don't have the look of standard male models. There is something dangerous about you." Dash offered a slow, half-grinning smirk, playing right into the intrigue. "Is that a good thing?" "Let's just say you could have your pick of any of the girls around the office," she replied, her eyes glinting with playful challenge. Dash let out a light, self-deprecating laugh, though a flicker of genuine amusement touched his ego. It was a useful distraction from the nightmare of the underground. Proof of this came immediately, as a pair of young editorial assistants walked past the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the office. Both stopped, glanced in, and openly gave him heavy, smoldering looks that left zero room for interpretation. Dash dragged his gaze away, meeting Yvette's knowing eyes with a smooth proposition. "I'll tell you what," Dash said, leaning in slightly. "I'll sign the release if you let me take you out for lunch." Yvette's smile widened into something genuinely pleased. She tapped the release form with her pen. "You have a deal, Mr. McCall. Call me Dash," he said. They found a small sunlit cafe tucked away on a quiet side street in the Latin Quarter, far from the suffocating luxury and dark opulence of the world Dash had inhabited the night before. The air smelled of fresh espresso, warm baguettes, and roasting coffee beans. Dash sat across from Yvette at a weathered wooden table, stirring a cube of sugar into his coffee. He looked at her across the rim of the cup. There was a grounded, authentic energy to her that cut through the artifice of Paris elite. She was beautiful, sharp, and possessed a quick intelligence that showed in every word she spoke. Still, A cynical voice in the back of his mind reminded him of the Baroness. Hopefully, Yvette didn't get off on the scent of blood and violence. Then again, she was French, and after the last 24 hours, Dash had learned that the city's charming exterior hid all kinds of dark complexities. You have made it clear that the girls in the office like me. But you didn't include yourself, Dash teased, leaning back with a lazy, disarming grin. Do you only see people through the camera lens? Yvette's cheeks flushed a soft, sudden pink, her dark eyes darting away for a split second, before she met his gaze again. I do find you attractive, Dash, she admitted, her voice dropping slightly as she wrapped her hands around her warm ceramic mug. But I know nothing about you. For all I know, you could be some psychopath. Dash let out a rich, genuine laugh, though a faint, ironic shadow crossed his eyes. Are you willing to risk it? Yvette tilted her head, a playful yet cautious smile touching her lips. I don't know yet, she answered. They continued to share their meal, the initial tension melting into easy laughter and sharp, playful banter as they lost track of time over flaky croissants and café au lait. All too soon, the afternoon sunlight shifted across the cobblestones, signaling that their break was over. Dash walked alongside Yvette down the breezy Parisian sidewalk, escorting her back toward the glass and steel facade of the Elle magazine offices. As they reached the entrance, Yvette paused, turning to face him with a lingering hesitation in her dark eyes. Will I see you again? She asked softly. I should be around for another week, Dash replied with a reassuring smile. I'm staying at the Ritz. Where will you go after that? She asked, her curiosity clearly getting the better of her. I will go back home, but my job takes me all over the world, Dash replied smoothly. Like Cairo? She asked, narrowing her eyes with a sudden, knowing intensity. Dash blinked, his relaxed posture instantly stiffening. Yes, why? I was there on an assignment a couple of years ago, and I remember a few buildings blowing up, Yvette said, her voice dropping to a low, steady murmur. Are you him? Are you McCall, the secret agent? Dash's smile vanished completely. The easy playboy act evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by the razor-sharp, lethal focus of a trained operative. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers with a chilling gravity. Yes, Dash said quietly, the air between them suddenly turning ice cold. But if you tell anyone who I am, it would be certain death for both of us. Yvette didn't flinch or look away. Instead, a slow, knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth. Your secret is safe, McCall, Yvette said softly. I knew there was something dangerous about you. The fact that Yvette knew who he was gave Dash an uneasy feeling. Not for himself. He knew he could handle himself in a tight spot, having slipped out of far worse jams than a blown cover in Paris. His real fear was for her safety. In his line of work, knowing the wrong things could get someone killed, and he couldn't bear the thought of her getting caught in the crossfire of his world. I would like to do another photo shoot with you, Yvette said, pulling him back from his thoughts. Do you want me naked, laid out on a bearskin rug? Dash teased, flashing a smooth, roguish grin. Something for your private collection, perhaps? That wasn't what I had in mind, she replied, her eyes sparkling with amusement. But if you're up to it. Dash laughed. I think you're simply trying to make the girls in the office jealous. I know they are watching from the windows. If I wanted to make them jealous, I would do this. With that, she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down and giving him a long, passionate, unforgettable kiss right there on the busy Parisian sidewalk. Pulling back just an inch, she offered a breathless, confident smile. I'll see you around, McCall, she said, then turned on her heel and walked briskly into the building, leaving Dash standing alone in the afternoon sun with his pulse racing and a genuine smile breaking through his tactical armor. He stood on the pavement for a moment, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching her silhouette recede through the glass. She was an impressive woman. The afternoon sun blurred into the dim, amber glow of a neighborhood cinema, where Dash lost himself in the stark, artistic rebellion of a French film. It was a calculated escape. Outside those doors, the morning papers were already screaming headlines about Julian Belmont's fatal plunge from the Rites balcony, and the corridors of his hotel were crawling with anxious French authorities. Dash kept his head down, avoiding police glances and stupid questions, biding his time until the initial swarm of investigators cleared away. When evening finally settled over the city, he returned to his suite, poured a heavy measure of scotch, and stepped out onto the balcony. He watched the twinkling lights of Paris stitch together the darkness, drawing slowly on a cigarette and finishing his drink before heading to bed to decompress. He had barely let out a breath against the mattress when a sharp, authoritative rap echoed at his door. Dash swung it open. Standing in the dim hallway was the Baroness's impassive chauffeur, a towering shadow in a tailored suit. "The Baroness requests your company for the night," the man said flatly. Dash's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew what he was going to have to do, whether he liked it or not, and whether he liked her or not, which, after witnessing her depraved euphoria at the opera house, he decidedly did not. He had seen the absolute cruelty rotting beneath her high society veneer. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and followed the chauffeur out into the Parisian night. When he arrived at her private residence, there would be no gentle lovemaking. There would be nothing soft or tender about this at all. He was going to play her game, and he was going to use her, just as ruthlessly as she used everyone else. The heavy silk sheets tangled around them like discarded ropes. The room was quiet, save for the ragged, uneven breathing of the woman who usually held absolute power over everyone in her orbit. By the time it was over and blood had been drawn, a sharp, accidental scratch traded in the heat of a brutal, unyielding struggle for control, Dash unbound the Baroness. She sat up slowly against the carved mahogany headboard, looking at him with wide-eyed, disbelieving amazement. She was used to being the one who commanded, who manipulated, who broke men down with psychological and sexual domination. It was her favorite tool, her weapon of choice. Dash had just shown her what true, unfiltered domination really looked like. And despite the shock, or perhaps because of it, she was utterly impressed. "That was amazing," she breathed, a breathless, dazed smile touching her lips as she rolled back against the pillows, her body aching with a strange, unfamiliar submission. Dash didn't answer her. He pulled away from the bed, his expression completely blank, stripped of any warmth or playfulness. He quietly gathered his clothes and dressed in the dim, silent room. When the first pale fingers of the morning sun started peeking through the heavy velvet drapes, Dash slipped quietly out the door, leaving the Baroness to wake up entirely alone. Chapter 8. Dash slept well past noon, letting the exhaustion of the previous days bleed away. The Underground Syndicate's next round of games wasn't scheduled until Friday night, leaving him with a couple of days to kill, plan, and keep his profile clean, while the police finished picking apart Julian Belmont's fatal plunge at the hotel. When he finally stepped out of his suite and crossed the lobby, the desk clerk handed him a stack of message slips. Most of them were frantic callbacks from the Baroness, all of which went straight into his pocket, ignored. But one name caught his eye: Yvette, asking him to meet her for dinner. That was an invitation he intended to accept. Instead of waiting for the evening, Dash made his way straight to the Elle magazine offices. He was ushered past reception and directly into Yvette's workspace. She looked up from a stack of proofs, her eyes brightening. "I'm glad you're here. I have an idea for that photo shoot," she said, practically buzzing with creative energy. "That's not why I'm here. I received your message and wanted to accept the offer for dinner in person," Dash replied with a slow, easy smile. Yvette offered a knowing, teasing smirk. "Dinner later. But first, come with me. She led him out of the office and down the corridor toward the building's main photography studio. Stepping inside was an immediate sensory overload. The sharp, rapid-fire clicking of shutters and the blinding pop of flashbulbs fill the cavernous space. In every corner of the room, models posed against different backdrops under towering lighting rigs. "I have a suit I would like you to wear," Yvette said, holding up a sleek garment draped over her arm. "It's the latest in avant-garde men's fashion." Dash eyed the modern, unconventional cut with quiet skepticism. He far preferred the classic, traditional tailoring of a bespoke Savile Row suit, but he wasn't about to argue. He decided to play along. Once he changed into the outfit, Yvette guided him toward a minimalist set. He had zero experience standing in front of a professional fashion lens, but his innate physical poise, sharp posture, and unreadable gaze carried him through. He simply stood, let the camera work, and played his part. By the time Yvette finally lowered her camera, flashing a wide, satisfied grin to signal she had more than enough shots, a small crowd had gathered near the edge of the set. She had been entirely right. The young female staff and assistants had crowded around to watch, and as Dash stepped out of the lights, it was obvious the office loved Dash McCall. It was a welcome, effortless distraction, a sharp, brilliant antidote to the lingering shadows of the Baroness and the blood-soaked games awaiting him on Friday. Dinner was an intimate, low-lit affair tucked away in a bohemian corner of the city, far from the polished marble and stifling pretension of the old money crowd. The venue was alive with the Paris art scene, a moody, smoky tavern where a three-piece jazz group drifted through smooth, melancholic chords, while beat poets took turns reciting verses over the notes. It was a world away from the high-stakes syndicates and aristocratic sadism Dash usually navigated. But the cozy, unpretentious atmosphere felt surprisingly grounding. Across the small candlelit table, Yvette looked ravishing. She wore a playful, daring mini-dress, a vibrant slice of modern French fashion that required a careful, conscious effort whenever she shifted in her seat to avoid revealing too much. Dash, of course, wouldn't have minded the view if she slipped. He always appreciated a good show. But beneath the rogue's appreciation, there was a genuine warmth in how easily she held his attention. After lingering over their meal and trading sharp, effortless banter well into the night, Dash walked her back to her apartment building through the cool Parisian air. At her door, she didn't invite him inside. Instead, she stood on the threshold, offering a soft, lingering smile as she thanked him for a truly lovely evening and suggested they meet up again tomorrow night. "I'd like that," Dash said. With a final nod, she unlocked her door and stepped inside. Dash stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the quiet night, a genuine, unforced smile resting on his face. He turned and walked into the Paris night, his hands in his pockets. It felt normal. It wasn't the life he was used to, moving in the shadows as an operative. But as the cool breeze brushed his face, he realized he could very easily learn to like it. Dash knew he still had a job to do, and keeping the Baroness waiting indefinitely was a luxury he couldn't afford. In her circle, prolonged absence or sudden indifference wasn't just rude, it was a liability, and crossing her could easily land him on the wrong side of the syndicate's games. So, bypassing his hotel entirely, he went straight to her estate. The moment he stepped through the door, she was waiting. "Where have you been? I've been trying to contact you all day," she demanded, her eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and hunger. Dash offered a slow, deliberate, sly grin. "I was resting. Last night was something else." A shiver of anticipation visibly ran through her. "It certainly was. I hope you are well rested because I want an encore." Dash didn't hesitate. He dropped the playboy mask instantly, snapping right back into the unyielding, dominant role she craved. "You'll get what I give you, and you'll like it," Dash said, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register. Get your ass on that bed. As you say, master, she murmured, a breathless obedience lacing her voice. Her skin still bore the faint, bruised reminders from the previous session, a testament to the raw intensity of their encounter. Moving with clinical precision, Dash bound her wrists to the bedposts, reaching over to pick up the leather flogger resting on the nightstand. What followed was an unfiltered, animalistic session. The sharper the strikes and the more severe his verbal degradation, the deeper she descended into a state of ecstatic, masochistic euphoria. She fed entirely on the radical power reversal, reveling in her own total subjugation. By the time the grueling encounter finally crested and ended, she was a quivering, breathless mess against the tangled sheets, her expensive makeup streaked and running down her face in dark tracks. Dash looked down at her with a chilling, absolute coldness, an utter indifference that somehow stoked her arousal even further. But inside, Dash felt a wave of profound self-disgust wash over him. This wasn't who he was. This brutal, degrading theater was light years away from the genuine connection he had shared with Yvette just hours before, and it bore no resemblance to his actual style of intimacy. It was a dirty mask he had to wear to survive, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth. Without a word, he turned away, quietly redressed in the silent room, and walked out into the night, heading straight back to the quiet anonymity of his hotel room. The next couple of days blurred together in a wonderful cinematic montage of light and laughter. Spending time with Yvette was a complete breath of fresh air, an effortless escape from the suffocating dark underworld of the Baroness and the looming dread of Friday's underground games. They packed their days and nights with the vibrant pulse of the city, strolling hand in hand through avant-garde art galleries in the Marais, front-row seats at high-energy fashion shows where Yvette knew everyone backstage, late-night indie theater productions, and cozy tables at tucked-away bistros where the wine flowed and the conversation never lagged. It was a true, unadulterated taste of Paris nightlife, bright and authentic. For a man whose life usually revolved around shadows, targets, and survival, Dash found himself genuinely losing track of the danger, wrapped up in the simple, intoxicating joy of being normal. The crisp champagne bubbles had barely settled on the balcony table when Yvette turned to Dash, her dark eyes flashing with a clear, unmistakable hunger. He was almost surprised she had held out this long. Most women in her orbit didn't wait days to make their move. That patient restraint only made her more attractive to him. Taking him gently by the hand, she led him away from the cool night air of the balcony and into the warmth of the bedroom. There were no elaborate mind games, no twisted power dynamics, and no forced cruelty. This was simply two people drawn to each other by a genuine mutual attraction. It was passionate, tender, and deeply human, a stark and welcome contrast to the cold theater he had played out with the Baroness. They stayed wrapped in each other's arms, making love through the quiet hours of the night. The next morning broke bright over the Parisian rooftops. They shared a warm, unhurried shower together before dressing for the day. "I hope to see you again before you leave," Yvette said softly, adjusting her bag over her shoulder as they stood near the suite's doorway. "You will. I will not leave without saying goodbye," Dash replied with a reassuring smile. With a final lingering kiss, she turned and left for her morning commute. She never made it to the office. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk outside the grand entrance of the hotel, two uniformed police officers stepped smoothly into her path, blocking her way. "You need to come with us, miss," one of them said, his tone flat and leaving no room for argument. Chapter 9. Friday night had arrived with the heavy, suffocating weight of an executioner's axe. "It's time to end this," Dash thought to himself. His jaw set as he stood in the quiet solitude of his hotel room, sliding the remote detonator into his tailored jacket pocket. A nagging spike of unease flickered in the back of his mind. He still hadn't heard from Yvette all day. Not a call, not a casual message checking in. He tried to convince himself she was just buried under a mountain of layouts and press deadlines at the office. But the silence felt entirely too wrong. He didn't wait for the Baroness to send her chauffeur or coordinate their arrival. Tonight, Dash wanted to control the board. He wanted to be the first one inside the private opera box. When he reached the grand, velvet-draped box, it was entirely empty, bathed in the amber glow of the crystal chandelier overhead. Moving with swift, practiced precision, Dash reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the 3 compact incendiary charges Gizmo had slipped him before he deployed to Paris. Kneeling out of sight of the corridor, he secured them discreetly beneath the plush framework of the box's velvet seating. With the charges planted and the remote detonator resting safely against his ribs, he had his insurance policy. If the syndicate thought they could continue treating human lives like betting chips, he was going to burn their entire playground to ash. He slipped back out into the grand hallway, descending the sweeping marble staircase down to the opulent main lobby, blending seamlessly into the early stream of high society patrons arriving for the evening's performance. As he stood near a towering pillar, admiring the intricate veins of the polished white marble work, a familiar gloved hand suddenly clamped hard around his arm. Dash turned. The Baroness stood beside him, draped in emerald silk and dripping with diamonds, her eyes alight with a manic, predatory thrill. "Are you ready, Dash?" she whispered, leaning in close so her breath brushed his cheek. "Tonight is going to be a special night." The heavy velvet curtains parted just enough to let the glare of a harsh white spotlight cut across the center of the stage. A murmur rippled through the plush boxes of the upper tier as 2 armed guards dragged a trembling young man into the brilliance of the beam, forcing him down onto his knees. Dash sat quietly in the shadows of the box beside the Baroness, his hand brushing the cold, hard contour of the remote detonator hidden inside his pocket. He forced his breathing to remain slow and steady, though every muscle in his frame was coiled tight. Above them, the static hiss of the overhead speaker system crackled to life, echoing a cold, synthesized baritone through the grand auditorium. "The man before you is a thief," the voice announced, dripping with haughty detachment. "He believes hunger is a reason to take what he hasn't paid for. Tonight, he will get the chance to have money in his pocket, or he will die trying." The young man under the spotlight squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving as silent sobs racked his frame. He was terrified. And looking down at the stage from the dark luxury of the elite gallery, Dash knew the kid had every good reason to be. A collective murmur of morbid amusement rippled through the shadowed private boxes as a synthetic voice echoed off the gilded balconies. The Baroness leaned in close to Dash, her breath hot against his ear, her fingers lightly tapping a manicured rhythm on her knee. "This will be a good one," she whispered, her eyes shining with cruel delight. Dash offered no response. His expression was a carved mask of stone, but beneath his tailored jacket, his thumb rested squarely against the small plastic casing of the remote detonator. He could feel the cold edge of the switches, just a click, and the entire structure would come down on them all. Down on the stage, the trembling young man stood over the lineup of silver platters, his face drained of all color. Shaking visibly, he reached out with a trembling hand and lifted the first lid. 20 francs will be awarded to you if you take a bite of this dog food," the loudspeaker droned. The captive swallowed hard, his stomach rolling. Desperate for any way out, he grabbed a spoon resting beside the dish, scooped a heavy dollop, and shoved it into his mouth, gagging as he forced himself to chew and swallow. A smatter of polite, mocking applause drifted from the high-tier boxes. "If you wish to continue, make your next selection," the voice commanded. Licking his lips, the young man stared wildly at the remaining silver domes. He reached out and placed a trembling hand on a lid stamped with a bold monetary value. 200 francs. He lifted it to reveal a thick, dark cut of meat resting on a porcelain plate. "For 200 francs, all you must do is enjoy this rare item," the speaker announced smoothly. Driven by desperation and the promise of the cash, the man didn't hesitate. He picked up a silver knife and fork, sliced off a generous portion, chewed it thoroughly, and forced it down his throat. A heavy, lingering silence hung in the auditorium for a split second, before the voice boomed again, dripping with sadistic theater. 200 francs for consuming human flesh. The realization hit the young man like a physical blow. His eyes went wide with sheer horror. He dropped his utensils, clamped both hands over his mouth, and doubled over, violently vomiting onto the polished wooden stage floor as a roar of ecstatic, cruel cheers erupted from the opera box. The young man wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling, sweat-slicked arm, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The cold, mechanical drone cut through the quiet horror of the room once more. Make your next selection. With tears streaming down his face and his whole body shaking like a leaf, the man reached out a trembling hand and lifted a heavy iron lid marked with a stark value. 700 francs. There was no food beneath this one. Resting on the velvet lining was a heavy, rusted meat cleaver. 700 francs to remove your thieving hand, the loudspeaker echoed, devoid of any human empathy. Panic flashed in the young man's eyes, quickly hardening into the desperate, hollow resolve of a cornered animal. Knowing there was no escape, he grabbed a strip of leather from the tray and cinched it tight around his right wrist as a makeshift tourniquet, biting down hard on his lower lip until it bled. He raised the heavy cleaver high above his head with his left hand, closed his eyes, and brought it down with a sickening, wet thud. A sharp, agonizing shriek tore through the auditorium. The man collapsed onto the stage, writhing and howling, in unimaginable pain, as blood pooled rapidly across the wood. His severed hand resting motionless beside the table. "No more!" he sobbed, screaming into the floorboards as he clutched his bleeding stump. "Please, no more!" From the wings, 2 armed guards strode out casually. They tossed a blood-stained canvas bag of coins onto the stage beside him, the heavy clink of francs ringing out over his cries, before roughly grabbing him by the shoulders and dragging his thrashing, screaming body off into the dark backstage corridors. Dash moved to pull away, his stomach twisting into a cold knot of pure fury. "I need some air, I've seen enough." The Baroness's fingers dug into his forearm with vicious bruising force, her nails biting straight through his sleeve. She hissed, pulling him back down into his seat with terrifying strength. "Sit, Dash," she whispered, her voice a poisonous purr right against his ear. "This is the one I have been waiting for. A game I concocted just for your amusement." Down on the stage, the overhead speaker crackled to life, the synthesized voice cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd. "For our final game," the voice rang out, cold and detached, "a test of how much pain a human body can handle." The spotlight snapped on, blindingly bright, illuminating the center of the stage. A heavy wooden cross stood planted upright in the boards, and bound tightly to it was a completely nude woman, her face entirely concealed beneath a dark canvas bag. "Do you recognize her, Dash?" the Baroness whispered, her grip tightening until his bones ached. "You should." With a sharp jerk, a stagehand stepped forward and yanked the bag off the woman's head. The breath instantly evacuated Dash's lungs. The cold, calculating facade of the trained operative fractured in a single heartbeat. It was Yvette. Her dark hair was matted with sweat, her eyes wide with terror, her skin pale under the harsh glare of the lights. "Of course you know her," the Baroness said, a dark, triumphant satisfaction dripping from every syllable. "It's the little whore you've been running to every time you leave me." Dash surged upward, the remote detonator burning a hole in his pocket, his face locked in a murderous glare as he turned on her. "What the fuck are you doing?" Dash demanded, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet snarl. The Baroness didn't even flinch. She met his blazing eyes with a sickening, unyielding smile. "Eliminating my competition," she answered softly. "You are mine, Dash." You will be with me, or you die. Dash violently wrenched his arm free from the Baroness's death grip, his hand plunging straight into the inside of his jacket. In one fluid, lethal motion born of years in the field, he cleared his holster, flicked off the safety, and put a single, decisive round through the Baroness's head before she could even draw another breath. Her lifeless body slumped instantly against the plush velvet seat. The surrounding elite patrons in the box shrieked in absolute terror, scrambling frantically into the far corners and cowering away from him. Dash didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the edge of the private box, grabbing a heavy velvet drape to break his momentum as he dropped hard onto the stage below. As two armed guards rushed out from the wings to intercept him, his pistol barked twice, dropping both men in their tracks before they could level their weapons. He sprinted straight to the wooden cross, his fingers working furiously at the thick hemp ropes biting into Yvette's wrists. The moment she was free, he stripped off his jacket and wrapped it tightly around her trembling, shivering frame. "I guess you get to see what I really do," Dash whispered softly, pressing a quick, fierce kiss to her forehead. "Let's move." They bolted into the dark, labyrinthine corridors behind the stage, gunfire echoing behind them as the remaining syndicate enforcers gave chase. Dash fired blind over his shoulder, keeping their heads down as he navigated the subterranean concrete halls by memory and instinct alone, bursting finally into the grand, smoke-filled main lobby. Breathing hard, he grabbed Yvette by the shoulders. "In the pocket of that jacket, there's something that feels like a small tube. Please, hand that to me." With trembling fingers, she reached inside the pocket of the tailored suit jacket he had draped over her and pulled out the small plastic casing, pressing the remote detonator into his palm. Without a second thought, Dash slammed his thumb down on the ignition button. A series of muffled, concussive explosions ripped through the backstage framework, and the entire marble structure beneath their feet gave a violent, teeth-rattling shudder. "We need to get the fuck out of here, now!" Dash yelled, hauling her toward the grand double doors. They burst out onto the Parisian sidewalk, just as the structural integrity of the historic building gave way entirely. Behind them, the majestic roof of the old opera house imploded in a roar of thunderous concrete and splintered timber, sending a massive, choking wall of dust billowing out the front doors and showering the street in a blinding rain of ash and debris. "Let's get you home," Dash said, his voice softening as he pulled her close against his chest. Sirens began wailing in the distance, cutting through the thick smoke and settling dust of the ruined opera house. But the chaos of the city felt a million miles away. Yvette looked up at him, her eyes wide with lingering shock, wrapped tightly in his oversized jacket. "Do you think they will come for me?" "Oh," Dash said firmly, wrapping his arms around her to shield her from the cool night air and the staring eyes of gathering onlookers. "That was the Baroness's game. She won't be playing anymore." She let out a shaky, ragged breath, burying her face against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry this happened. It's my fault. I would understand if you hated me," Dash said. Instead of answering with words, she tilted her chin up and kissed him, deep, fierce, and entirely unyielding. When she pulled back, a faint, resilient ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I don't hate you," Yvette said softly. "Just promise me that you won't get involved with any more crazy bitches while you are in Paris." Dash smiled, the last heavy weight of the underworld finally slipping off his shoulders. "Just you, baby, just you." Chapter 10. Dash returned to his hotel room, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who could pack a suitcase in the dark. Once his belongings were secured, he picked up the heavy rotary telephone on the bedside table and placed an international call back to headquarters. It rang twice before a familiar, no-nonsense voice answered on the other end. "Report," V said crisply. "The mission has been completed," Dash said, his voice level. "Good," V replied, the faint sound of paper shuffling coming through the receiver. "I expect a complete debriefing when you return. Your flight leaves in the morning." Dash leaned against the wall, looking out the window toward the smoldering skyline where the opera house had stood. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I would like to extend my time in Paris. There was a brief pause on the line, heavy with silent assessment. A woman! A dry edge to the tone. Yes, V, Dash answered without hesitation. I put her in danger. It wouldn't be right to leave so suddenly. Another short silence hung in the air before V gave a measured sigh. 1 week, V replied. Then have your ass back at District 9. There is work to do. The final week melted away in a glorious, unhurried blur of indulgence. Days bled into nights filled with candlelit dinners, passionate embraces, impromptu photo shoots in Yvette's studio, and countless intimate moments shared behind closed doors. It was an unapologetic celebration of life and connection, entirely divorced from the shadows of syndicates, bombs, and blood. On the final night before Dash's flight back to America, they lay tangled in the sheets of her bed, bathed in the soft glow of the Parisian street lamps filtering through the window. The lingering warmth of an incredible lovemaking session hung thick in the air. Dash reached over to the nightstand, lit a joint, took a slow draw, and passed it to her. Yvette took a light drag, letting the smoke drift up toward the ceiling before resting her head against his bare chest, tracing lazy circles on his skin. I know you're leaving in the morning, but will you come back to see me? She asked softly, her voice carrying a quiet vulnerability. Or if I get an assignment to do a shoot in America, can I see you? Dash turned his head, looking down at her with a gentle, reassuring warmth in his eyes. Darling, I never know where I'm going to be from one day to the next, Dash replied, his tone tender yet honest. This line of work requires constant movement, but I will return to Paris when I can, and if we should ever find ourselves in the same place, we will find each other. He offered a slow, reassuring smile, letting the smoke curl away into the quiet room. For now, let's just enjoy the time we have. With a soft murmur of agreement, he shifted his grip, pulling her back up on top of him as the world outside faded away, sealing their final night together with a deep, lingering kiss. The heavy drone of the aircraft engines vibrated through the cabin as the wheels lifted off the tarmac, leaving the glittering lights of Paris behind. Dash stared out the small oval window, a complex mix of emotions settling in his chest. There was the familiar, quiet relief of a mission successfully executed and a target eliminated, weighed down by the distinct, heavy ache of leaving Yvette behind. But beneath the sadness was the hardened reality he had lived with for years. He was Dash McCall. This wasn't the first time he had packed a bag and walked away from a woman who had managed to pierce his armor, and across the globe, it certainly wouldn't be the last. It was the unavoidable tax of the life he chose. He leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes as the plane punched through the cloud layer, and headed west toward the stark, demanding corridors of District 9. Until next time, Paris, he murmured quietly to himself. Dash walked into V's office, squaring his shoulders and giving a sharp mock salute. Dash McCall, reporting for duty, sir, he said, a familiar, easy confidence in his voice. V looked up from a stack of encrypted operational files, a knowing, amused grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'm glad to have you back, Dash, V said, leaning back in his leather chair and lacing his fingers together. Give me a report of the mission. Without missing a beat, Dash launched into a full, unedited debriefing. He laid it all out for his superior. Julian Belmont's shadowy operations, the Baroness and her sadistic high society games, McCall Oil serving as their operational cover, and Yvette, right down to how she had been dragged into the crosshairs. He left nothing out. V listened in silence, his expression unreadable as he absorbed the fallout of a destroyed opera house and a dismantled Parisian syndicate. When Dash finally finished, V tapped a single finger against the mahogany desktop. Luckily for you, the city of Paris had that old opera house scheduled for commercial demolition next month, V said dryly. You just gave them a head start. But there seems to be a missing detail. Dash frowned, his brows drawing together in genuine confusion. A missing detail? What do you mean? I told you everything. Did you? V asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Explain this. With a flick of his wrist, V slid a glossy, freshly printed magazine across the polished desk. Dash looked down, recognizing the distinctive, elegant script across the cover. The latest issue of L. Dash let out a low chuckle, flashing a grin. I didn't know you read women's magazines, V. Page 22, V replied, entirely unfazed. Sighing playfully, Dash flipped open the magazine and turned to the designated page. Staring right back up at him from a full-page spread was his own face. Sharp jawline, piercing gaze, and immaculate tailoring, accompanied by a bold, dramatic headline. Exciting new male model takes Paris by storm. Dash cleared his throat, trying to look innocent. V fixed him with a stare, trying hard to project commanding anger, though his voice betrayed a deep current of amusement. Is this what you call maintaining a low profile, Dash? Dash offered a lopsided, unrepentant grin, leaning casually against the edge of the desk. Look, V, I had to have something to do between tracking down targets and surviving game nights. V shook his head, a chuckle finally breaking through his stern facade. And just what should we do if my secure lines start getting calls for commercial modeling gigs? Simple, Dash said without missing a beat. Tell them I only worked for one specific photographer back in Paris. If that doesn't work, quote them an outrageous retainer. And if that doesn't work, accept the job. District 9 could always use the extra cash flow. Dash walked out of V's office with a quiet chuckle, the tension of the past week completely gone. Heading straight down the secure corridors to his quarters, he dropped his duffel bag on the bed and took a deep breath. District 9 was cold, sterile, and entirely devoid of Parisian charm. But it was home. As he unbuttoned his jacket, he couldn't help but smile at the memory of Yvette's studio, the smoky jazz clubs, and the wild, chaotic night the old opera house finally came down. He had traded bullets and blood for avant-garde fashion and a brief taste of normalcy, and somehow he had survived both. He kicked off his boots and reached for a cigarette. There would be new targets, new syndicates, and new assignments waiting for him on Monday morning. But for right now, the mission was over, and Dash McCall was right where he needed to be. After unpacking his gear, Dash made his way down to the sublevels of the District 9 compound, navigating the maze of industrial corridors until he reached the heavy steel blast doors of the R&D lab. The familiar smell of ozone, burnt solder, and hot oil hit him the moment he stepped inside. Gizmo was elbow-deep in the chassis of a disassembled machine, surrounded by scattered tools, glowing tubes, and a nest of tangled wires. "Hey, Giz!" Dash yelled over the high-pitched whine of a nearby power converter. Gizmo jerked his head up, his eyes magnified to comical proportions behind his thick, Coke bottle eyeglass lenses. A smudge of black grease smeared across his forehead as he let out an exasperated sigh. "It's about time you got home," Gizmo snapped, though a flicker of genuine relief crossed his face. Dash offered a cocky, easy grin, leaning against a workbench piled high with circuit boards. "Aw, did you miss me? Or do you just have new things you want to try to blow me up with?" Gizmo gave a sharp, dry laugh, wiping his hands on a stained rag. "A little of both, actually. Tell me, how did those charges work out in the field?" Dash's expression leveled out, though a hint of amusement remained in his eyes as he thought back to the burning ruins of the Parisian landmark. The three were more than enough to blow a group of sick aristocrats straight to hell and give the city a massive head start on demolishing an old opera house, Dash replied smoothly. Gizmo grinned, a wicked, toothy smile spreading across his face as he went back to wrenching a loose bolt. "Good," Gizmo muttered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I always hated the fucking opera anyway." Dash and Gizmo continued to swap stories over the hum of the lab's equipment, trading tales of past close calls and botched gear tests. But the casual atmosphere was cut short as the heavy steel door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. V stepped into the workshop, holding a thick, cream-colored manila envelope stamped with red classification seals. "McCall, you leave Monday for Milan," V announced, stopping near the workbench. "There's an extortion ring operating out of the fashion district that needs to be permanently dismantled." Dash raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. "Milan?" V's lips curved into a sharp, mischievous grin, his eyes gleaming with the memory of the Elle magazine spread sitting on his office desk. "Just in time for Fashion Week," V said smoothly, tapping the envelope against his leg. Dash couldn't help the smirk that broke across his face, recognizing the setup immediately. "Looks like the hottest new male model in Paris goes international," Dash replied. The autumn air of Milan was crisp, carrying the unmistakable energy of Fashion Week as the city flooded with designers, agents, and shutterbugs. The bustling streets were a blur of tailored wool, bold prints, and hurried footsteps. Amidst the chaos near the steps of the venue, Dash stood quietly, watching a familiar figure working the crowd. A woman with a camera pressed to her eye, expertly framing the models and capturing the frantic, high-stakes movement of the street trends. He crossed the cobblestone pavement, stepping softly until he stood directly behind her shadow. "Where do you need me?" he asked, his voice low and rich. Yvette froze. The camera lowered from her face as her breath hitched. She didn't need to turn around to know the voice, but when she did, their eyes locked instantly. The noise of the bustling Milan crowd seemed to fade into a distant hum. Dash and Yvette, together again. A bright, disbelieving smile broke across her face. "You're late," she laughed softly. Without another word, she dropped her camera strap against her chest, threw her arms around his neck, and pulled him in, sealing the reunion with a long, deeply passionate kiss.